Good evening, everyone. We'll start here just another few seconds or so. Just give folks time to log in.
Even though I spent my whole life searching,
Okay, well, welcome everyone. We're here tonight to talk about the 2023 proposed coastal fall salmon seasons. My name is Mike Galvin. I'm the Recreational Fisheries Program Manager for Oregon Fish and Wildlife, and with me tonight is Michelle Dennehy from our Information Education Program, and Bob Swingle, who's recording this. This presentation tonight will be recorded, and we'll be streaming it after the meeting is over. So if you hadn't had a chance to come tonight, or if you want to watch it again, it'll be available on our website, and I'll go into the details of where you can find that later. Tonight, again, we're here to talk about the coastal salmon, fall salmon. We're going to have a fairly detailed presentation tonight, and we'll go do an overview of the status of the coastal salmon. And then we'll step through the different fishery proposals that ODFW is having this year on the whole coast, from the north coast all the way down to the south coast. So there's a lot of information, and we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to ask us as many questions as you want to ask us. So there's three different ways that you can interact with this meeting tonight to submit questions. First, and I'll explain this really quickly, is you can go to our website. You can go to myodfw.com, and up in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the little magnifying glass, and you can search there for fall coastal salmon. When you do that, you can click the link that shows up for fall coastal salmon management. And on that page, that's where all the information will live when it comes to the fall coastal salmon management in this year and years to come. But on that page, you'll see a button that you can submit questions. So that's one way. The second way is, on this YouTube video, there's a description box below. There's a couple of different links in there, and one of those links is a questions link, so you can directly click there. And also you can subscribe to our channel. So if you want more information in the future about ODFW, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And the third way, and for those of you that are, have your smartphones or your tablets or a device that can scan, you can simply scan the QR code that's shown here on the screen. That'll take you directly to the question page, and you can type your question in right there. We'll show all this information at the end as well. So if you didn't write that down or scan it right now, you'll see this again, and we'll leave this information up at the end as we're going through our Q&A session. Again, at the end of this presentation, we'll be filtering through and looking through the questions that come in, and then providing those to our district biologists, who are also now all online with us, and then we'll be doing sort of a live Q&A with the questions that come in, with our district biologist providing a response. We think that a lot of the questions that we received so far will be covered in the presentation. So if there's anything else that comes up that is of interest to you, feel free to give us your question in one of these methods. With all that being said, I'm going to start this presentation, pass it over to and introduce Sean Clements. He's the Fish Division Deputy Administrator, and he's going to provide an overview of the coastal salmon status.
Cheers, Mike. And yeah, thanks everyone for joining us tonight, or later on if you're watching the rerun. So Chinook have been in the news a lot recently, and a lot of time that's for the wrong reasons. So we want to share with you the picture we're seeing and go over our thinking for the coming fall season, so that you can share feedback with us before we make a final decision later this month. So in terms of the news I mentioned, you recall that last year we closed several fisheries in 5 basins on the coast. That was in response to predicted poor returns in those areas. In addition, there's been a lot in the news this year about the ocean fisheries being closed south of Cape Falcon, and that was really driven by some record low returns in the Sacramento and Klamath areas down in California, which was largely caused by the extreme drought that those fish have been enduring the last few years. And then some of you may also be aware that National Marine Fisheries Service is currently considering whether to list the coastal and Southern Oregon, Northern California Chinook under ESA. We're expecting a decision from them on that sometime this summer. So given all that news, you might be wondering where we feel Chinook are currently. And in our comments to NOAA, we kind of relayed that we think the ESUs still remain viable as they did in 2014. But we did point out that we have some concerns in some basins and that there are longer term challenges associated with these worsening environmental conditions. And that's some of the information we want to share with you today. And then as we think about crafting these fall seasons, how we're going to adapt to that. Next, Mike. So in 2023, what are we expecting? So we do expect there to be improvements in some basins. That's largely based on the return of 4-year-olds, which is the historical majority of the runs on the coast. These fish went out in 2020, which were NOAA categorized as fair ocean entry conditions. And that was an improvement over the fish. The bulk of the fish that returned last year went out in 2019, which were into poor ocean conditions. So there should be some improvement in some basins. Caveat there being, though, that those 4-year-olds also went out. If you recall, back in 2020, we had a pretty severe drought, and there was low flows early on in the year when these fish were out migrating. So that could have had some impact on them that's not captured in our forecasts. Next, Mike. So overall, across the coastal ESU, we are seeing some warning signs in some basins that we wanted to kind of go through with you. These fall into a few different categories. So for example, on the left here, we've got the Nestucca time series. This is going back to 1986 and through to just last year. And you can see that there's, in the blue line, there's this kind of declining trend over a long time series. The population is remaining above critical abundance, but we're seeing this decline over time. And then in the Siuslaw, in contrast, you'll see that prior to 2014, the orange line, the trend there was pretty stable and even potentially increasing. But then since 2014, we've had this really marked decrease, and the red and orange dots mark years where we've been below or just above critical abundance. So not a good situation there. And then switching over to the Tillamook, you can see there's kind of this combination of factors where in the blue line again, we've got this long-term decreasing trend, but then since 2014, again, we've had these years marked in the red and orange dots where we've been below or just above critical abundance. So a lot of changes, particularly since 2014. A lot of that was associated with the shift to really poor ocean conditions, the blob, that kind of thing. But there's also things going on in freshwater that's impacting some of these runs. Next up, Mike. So one of those is predation. So I think folks are probably pretty familiar by now with the situation in the Coquille. There's been a real collapse there since the late 2010s. And that's largely associated with smallmouth bass predation, which were illegally introduced in the early 2010s and have since colonized a large portion of the basin. And they're really impacting the juveniles during their outmigration. And you'll see there that there's been a number of years well below critical abundance, and we have significant concerns about the long-term health of that population and its ability to rebound. And last year, we took the step of starting a conservation hatchery in partnership with the Coquille Indian tribe. What folks may not be as aware of is what's going on in the Umpqua, where we do have concerns about what may be developing there. So the Umpqua is warmer than other coastal rivers. The temperature is also increasing, and that leads to increased stress and mortality in the juveniles. It's also leading to increased predation because the smallmouth bass are becoming active earlier, and so they're starting to overlap more with the outmigration, particularly of coho and Chinook. So that's one concern. And then we've also had a lot of anecdotal reports from anglers of an increase in striped bass population down the lower river, and that also could be impacting these runs as they outmigrate. And then our own abundance and survey data indicating that there's issues across species and runs in this basin. So I think folks are probably familiar with the summer steelhead that collapsed a little bit ago. They have recovered somewhat above critical abundance last year, but they're still at a low level. And we're seeing issues both in the ocean and in freshwater there, where the temperatures are really impacting both the the adults coming back and the juveniles during that migration. Then in Coho, last year we had a really low return in the South Umpqua. I think it was on the order of 200 fish in that area, which is a real drop from the average of 2 to 12,000, and indicates that there may be something going on in freshwater there. And then likewise, fall Chinook, it's not necessarily showing up in the abundance trends, but we did have some concerning signs early on with fall Chinook abundance in the South Umpqua last year. So potentially there's something developing in the Umpqua, and we're keeping an eye on that. Next up. So the trends were the first kind of thing that we're seeing in some of these basins that are causing some concern. The other thing that we're seeing is that over time, harvest rates in freshwater are increasing. So in the top left here, there's data from 4 basins along the coast, going back from 1986 through to 2020, and broken up into 10 or so year periods. And you'll see that there's a general increase in that trend of harvest rates in freshwater over time. It bounces around from year to year depending on what the bag limits and seasons are, but it's generally increasing. And then conversely, we get questions about what's happening with ocean harvest. And you'll see on the graph on the lower right that this is data from NOAA, that ocean harvest is actually decreasing. That's the blue line. And you'll see it was, this is data from the Thales law, that it's decreased from about 50% down into the 40-odd% range over the last couple of decades. In contrast, you can see again that freshwater harvest has been increasing in the Thales law over time. And that's a similar pattern to we see in several basins along the coast. So that combination of some of those trends and these increasing freshwater harvest rates are some of the things we're looking at as we craft this year's seasons. And then next. The other thing that's going on here is that there's a lot of changes happening in the environment. I think you're all familiar with a lot of them, having lived through the heat domes, the drought, seen a lot of the fires. I hear a lot about predation, and you've also heard about the blob. What these changes are doing is not only impacting the runs themselves, but they're also impacting our ability to forecast, because we cannot capture some of these changes in our forecasts. So that leads to increased risk of forecast inaccuracy and overharvest. And this kind of image in the top left here is just one example of some of these changes. So this is taken a few days ago. It's an image of the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, and you'll see the El Nino that's developing along the equator there. But what's kind of interesting in this image is looking in that box in the Northeast Pacific, you'll see a blob of warm water. And that's the warmest it's been in 40 years at this time. And it's those kind of changes that we just cannot capture in some of our forecasts, and that can have impacts on our runs. So for example, if our fish happen to be in that blue zone, then things would happen to be pretty good. But if they're in that orange to red zone, then there'd be impacts. So those three things together are kind of what's causing us some concerns and causing us to think about how we go about these seasons this fall. Next slide, Mike. So all of this is not happening in isolation in Oregon. In fact, Oregon's doing a lot better than most of our surrounding states across the Pacific Northwest. I think folks are familiar that there's a lot of closures happening in Alaska. Washington, similarly, there's a lot of constraint because of ESA listed populations, and also the harvest of the coastal runs being constrained by the same issues as in Oregon. And then in California, you're probably all really familiar that the recreational salmon fishing down there is closed this year because of the low returns. And in talking with the managers in BC, it's a similar picture there. A lot of restrictions going in place because of poor returns coming in. Next. So, as I said, kind of Oregon is actually standing out as a place where things are not doing as badly as a lot of other states, and we want to keep it that way. So what we're looking at this year is some seasons that are crafted to try and maintain that opportunity. but there are some restrictions. And so one of the things we're doing is moving away from the stratum aggregate limits for a couple of reasons. One, the patterns we're seeing now are really, the strata are not behaving as one. So for example, the Tillamook and the Nehalem are behaving differently. The Alsea and the Saisler are behaving differently. So managing at the stratum level doesn't make sense anymore. What that also allows, though, is that if people are able to move between basins, they can take advantage of opportunities in each of those basins without being subject to those aggregate limits. The other thing we'd like to do is reduce the bag limits to ensure we stay above critical abundance and avoid those future closures. And all of this builds on existing actions. So for example, over the past several years and starting with the CMP, we lowered deadlines to protect spawning fish and avoid harassing them. And then there's been extensive work done by the department and also by partners, including a lot of you on this call likely, to restore habitat and open up passage. And that's really what's going to help build the populations back up to desired status and allow us to have more robust fisheries. And then I think folks are aware that in 2026, we start to review the CMP, and that's a time when we can consider new approaches to managing harvest. Next. So in addition to sharing information on this webinar, we really want to hear your feedback. So we're proposing 2 alternatives for wild Chinook harvest. The first alternative is this consistent coast-wide basin-specific approach to setting bag limits, which recognizes some of the recent issues that I've just talked about. And alternative 2 would allow some additional harvest in some basins based on the forecast, but keep in mind that this may increase the risk of impacting future opportunity. We want to hear your feedback via the survey or directly to any of our DBs or via email to myself or others involved in this process. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Knutson, who's one of our watershed managers. He's going to run through the different proposals for the basins. And before I end, I just want to say I really focused on Chinook here, where we are seeing a lot of warning signs. I didn't spend a lot of time talking about coho or any time, and that's because we're seeing a lot of good news on the coho front. We see continued strong returns, and that's allowing us to offer some additional opportunity for wild coho harvest this year in the coastal zone. And we expect that to continue. They've weathered the poor ocean conditions pretty well, and we're in active discussions with NOAA about delisting them in the next 5-year review period. So that's something the state will be pushing pretty hard for, and it's a good news story. So over to you, Chris.
All right, thank you, Sean. Hope I make it through this. I just finished with a sneezing attack due to hay fever, but I think I'm okay now. It's good to be here, and thanks for joining. And Sean, thank you for setting the stage. I think those points fit very nicely into what we're going to talk about relative to bag limits for this year. Again, my name is Chris Knutson. I'm the North Coast Watershed District Manager, and my office is in Tillamook. This is going to be fairly high level discussion. I'm going to go over bag limits for each of the basins. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail regarding season dates and areas, primarily because most of those aren't changing this year compared to what you're used to. So up here now, I have a slide for the North Coast management area, and I kind of want to lay out for you what we're looking at here. So again, it's for the North Coast, and across the top of this table here, we have the species and the type, and type in this case is just wild or hatchery. So we're going to talk about bag limits and opportunities for wild Chinook, hatchery Chinook, wild coho, and hatchery coho. And then on the far left column is just the basin name. And again, the areas that are normally open to angling are the areas we're talking about tonight. And there'll be more detail on the website where there are any changes proposed. And so under wild Chinook, Sean talked about alternative 1 and alternative 2. So each of these tables will have both those alternatives listed. In some cases, you're going to see that the alternative 1 is similar to or exactly the same as alternative 2. And that's just because, you know, in that specific case, there really isn't that management flexibility or potential additional opportunity in the basin. So under bag limits here, you'll see the 1/2. That's kind of jargony. I think a lot of us that dealt with these bag limit issues over the last, you know, forever, 10 years, get used to saying 1 and 2. 1 and 2 just means 1 per day, 2 for the season. And the season in this case, we're talking about the late summer or fall Chinook season. So depending on where you are, those will either start in July and August. So that's just kind of setting the background for this slide. So I'll jump into the Nicanicum, relatively small basin on the north coast with a small population. And alternative 1 is 1 wild Chinook per day, 2 for the season. And like I said, alternative 2 is exactly the same. It's a small basin, not a lot of flexibility there. Nicanicum does have a small hatchery Chinook program, so that will continue as usual. So let's jump down to the Nehalem. The alternative 1 option is 1 per day, 2 per season. The alternative 2 is 1 per day, 5 per season. Okay, now you'll see in parentheses below that a 1 and 1 under each. And that's referring to the Nehalem protective period, which runs through September 15th. So during that protective period, the proposed bag limits are 1 for the period. Okay, so that'd be if you had 1 Chinook, 1 wild adult Chinook, prior to September 15th in the Nehalem Basin, under these rules, you'd only have 1 for that period. And if it was a 1 and 2, you could get 1 additional for the period after that, September 16th on. Or if it was a 1 and 5, there would be opportunity for 4 more wild adult Chinook. So hopefully that made sense. But it's a 1 and 2 and 1 and 5 for the Nehalem. Wild coho is being proposed again, which is great, under a 1 per day, 2 for the season. That's for the basin. So 1 per day, 2 for the Nehalem Basin. And I should point out that this will be the first year where we have a full complement or adult hatchery coho returning from the wild broodstock program in the Nehalem. So that should provide hopefully a great opportunity if the coho decide to bite this year. There's quite a few of them in the bay last year, they didn't decide to bite. But so that's exciting, and that applies both to the Nehalem and Tillamook for those wild broodstock programs. And as usual, hatchery coho are also available in the Nehalem. Going down to the Tillamook, as you recall, last year was closed to harvest a wild adult Chinook in the Tillamook Basin last year. Fortunately, this year, we have some fishery option here under a 1 per day, 2 per season scenario under both alternatives. And again, as usual, hatchery Chinook are available in the Tillamook Basin, wild coho under a 1 and 2 this year, and hatchery coho are also available. The Stucca, 1 and 5 under both alternatives, hatchery Chinook available, and a wild coho opportunity. And we'll have more information on those dates for these wild coho fisheries on the North Coast, but expect them to be a Wednesday and Saturday scenario starting towards the middle of September. So I think I can go to the next slide. Excuse me. So we're in the mid-coast now. Same format on this slide as the last slide. I'll take one more drink of water, thank you. All right, Salmon River. Alternative 1, 1 and 5. Alternative 2, 2 and 10. So we're going to want your feedback on those. Hatchery Chinook, as usual, are available in the Salmon River. In the Sluts River, we have a 1 and 5. the 2 and 10. And Sluts also has a protected period. They're both listed as 1 and 2. And that protected period ends July 31st, I believe. And that's really applying to those spring Chinook that come back into that basin. Wild coho fishery proposed in the Slets under a 1 and 1. The difference between these mid-coast wild coho fisheries and the north coast is these wild coho fisheries run 7 days a week. And I'm not going to go into the detail here, but they all start at different times. So you'll be looking for a table in our website to describe that better for you. On the Aquina, 1 and 5, and the 2 and 10 with a wild coho opportunity of 1 and 1. The LC, 1 and 5, 2 and 10 with wild coho. Yachats, relatively small basin, keep in mind, 1 and 2 with 1 and 5, no opportunities this year for wild coho. And then the Sayusla, which was closed to all salmon angling last year, fortunate to have an opportunity there this year, but it would be under a 1 and 2 bag limit scenario as proposed, and a wild coho fishery under a 1 and 1. So a little better this year for the Sayusla than we had to experience last year. On Beaver Creek, that small tributary, it's not a Chinook stream, but we, like last year, will have a wild coho opportunity, 1 and 1. Go to the next, thank you. This one gets a little bit busier. The Umpqua, and Sean detailed some of the issues going on in the Umpqua, particularly the South Umpqua. Wild Chinook opportunities, 1 and 5 under both scenarios. Hatchery Chinook are available, as are hatchery coho. In the Coos, looking at a 1 and 5 or a 2 and 10. Hatchery Chinook remain available. Wild coho opportunity, 1 per day, 3 for the season. So good opportunity for coho there. Coquille, we know that's closed because of the issues with wild fall Chinook there. Hatchery Chinook is closed to conserve fish for that conservation hatchery program. And wild coho would operate under a 1 and 3 bag limit scenario. And there'll be a specific area for that. And Mike Gray will have more detail on that, and that information would be on the website as well. La Flora's, small basin, limited opportunity, 1 and 1 under both scenarios for wild Chinook. Wild coho opportunity under a 1 and 2. Going down to the 6s, we're looking at a 1 and 5 under alternative 1 and a 1 and 10 under alternative 2. No hatchery Chinook or wild coho opportunities there. The elk would be closed for wild Chinook and open for hatchery Chinook. Now down to the South Coast. A little bit easier here for the South Coast. Pretty much everything's operating under a permanent rule in terms of the recreational fisheries, except Hunter Creek, which would operate under a 1 and 2 scenario. Keep in mind, hatchery Chinook and hatchery coho are available in the Rogue, and hatchery Chinook are available in the Chetco. And we can go. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't say the Windchuck. Maybe that's why you were pausing. Windchuck, 1 and 5, Chetco, 1 and 5, Pistol, 1 and 5 for Chinook. Thanks. Thanks for the nonverbal cue. All right, other important things to note. On the North Coast, streams would be closed for Chinook, all Chinook, hatchery and wild, during the month of December. Quick little bit of background. These North Coast streams had kind of been known for a lot of years for their late returning wild Chinook, and we actually have a hatchery program that took part of that late returning component for years. It's been struggling, trying to meet broodstock needs for that program have been a challenge. And so we're proposing a December closure to Chinook. That's not going to affect a lot of anglers, but it would be important to preserve broodstock. They're also looking at establishing bubbles in the nearshore ocean outside of Nehalem and Tillamook. This would run concurrent with the ocean Chinook fisheries and basically bring the bag limit regulations from the bay out to these nearshore areas. And there'll be information on that. But for those of you who have fished Nehalem and Tillamook in the past, those bubbles would be pretty much similar to what we've had previously. On the mid coast, proposal is to close Lake Creek to all salmon angling. And just to note that lakes will continue to be open for wild coho under permanent rule. Those are the Silk Goose and Taconich and 10 Mile Lakes. And just as you're out there, you're fishing on these wild coho, keep in mind that coast-wide, your aggregate for the season is 5 wild adult coho. So keep that in mind if you get into them. And I think maybe there's one more slide. Okay, so these are the ocean terminal areas being proposed for the elk and sixes and the Chetco. And the elk, it's November 1 through 30. Daily limits for recreational would be 1 Chinook. Commercial would be 10. The season and landing limits are set to limit harvest to less than 600 Chinook. This is a fishery that's been open, obviously in the past, last open in 2018. It coincides with there's a general ocean commercial and recreational season open until October 31. And then this fishery, I guess, would follow that November 1 to November 30th. Okay, Chetco recreational fishery and a commercial fishery. You can see the dates here. I'm not going to read them for you. Recreational bag of 1 Chinook, commercial 8 with a season quota of 400. Fisheries designed to be equitable split between rec and commercial. This is a fishery that's been around since 1992, last opened in 2018. There is no general ocean commercial or recreational Chinook salmon season this year. So if the terminal fishery were to be adopted, the river would be closed from the mouth to river mouth 2.2 from October 7th to October 15th. And as always, feel free to contact Steve Mazer at the Gold Beach Field Office, and his phone number's right there if you don't already have it on your speed dial. I think that's all I have.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Appreciate that. Well, we're going to move on to the next slide here. So that's it for the most of the presentation here. We have opportunity now to first, I want to make sure that you all know where to find all the additional information that Chris has been referring to. This was pretty high level. There's a lot more detail in there to understand, but there's a few different ways, again, that you can access this information. Again, you go to myodfw.com, you search for the fall coastal salmon, and you click the link for fall coastal salmon management. Okay, and on there you're going to see and find all the information that we talked about tonight, and even more. So that's a really good place if you want more information to go. On that page, you'll find a few things. We talked about submission of questions. So again, you can go there and continue to submit questions on these proposals. And also, as Sean talked about, there's a survey that we really are looking for your feedback on. So the survey will be available at 7 o'clock tonight. The questions button will also be there, and both of those will be available until June 23rd, so a week from this Friday. So you have some time to think it over, share it with your friends, watch this presentation again, and keep asking us questions. The survey is really important. We're looking for that feedback. The other way to get to the survey is in the YouTube channel here. Down below in the description box is a link directly to the survey. So again, that'll be available right around 7 o'clock. We're going to post this webinar again, so you can share with friends and family. And then the additional detailed information is we'll have a table on there that shows all of these bag limits that we talked about, and all the details will be available on that website. The other way to get there is, again, to scan this QR code on the screen now, and that will take you directly to that Fall Coastal Salmon Management webpage. I'll pause just for a second so people can scan that if you'd like. And now we're going to move into sort of the last phase of the evening, where we have opportunities to answer questions from the public. So I'm going to leave this information up here for you all, so that you can navigate your way depending on how you're viewing us tonight. Again, go to our website. The description box below has a link directly to the questionnaire, or you can scan that QR code. And I'm going to turn my camera off, and then I'm going to look at the questions that we have. And then what we're going to do here is, as we ask questions for a specific biologist, they'll pop up on the screen and answer that question. Okay. So first question is for Sean. Sean, question from Oregon Anglers Alliance. The question is, are these proposals for the 2023 year only?
Cheers, Mike. And yeah, thanks, Leonard. So these are for 2023 only. Again, we're looking at each year's data as it comes in. So the forecast, confidence in the forecast, ocean and freshwater conditions, and all those things. And we're making decisions based on that information within the framework that was established during the CMP process, but also in the context of the issues that I laid out early in the presentation. So yeah, we are looking at 2023 here.
Okay, Sean, don't go anywhere, because there's a few more for you here. Another one from Oregon Anglers Alliance. Will the data presented tonight be available after the webinar for review, so that they may provide comment based on the data that's presented?
Yeah, so the website you've been directing people to on myodfw.com will have the webinar. It will have a 2 or 3 page document that lists the 2022 statement, 23 forecasts, the 2 alternatives for Chinook with the dates, and then the coho bag limits and dates, as well as all the details about the ocean bubbles. And then it also has links in that document to other locations on our website where we keep the wild fish monitoring summaries. So that has data going back sometimes into the 80s in terms of what those runs have been doing over the last few years. So folks should be able to gather all the information through that website.
Okay, thanks, Sean. Sean, there was a series of questions from OAA related to El Nino and how it impacts the fishery. So maybe you can give us a broad overview of El Nino and the impacts.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, we talked for quite a while about El Nino and La Nina and their impacts. It's really not entering the decision making for this fall. I think probably the question's coming up because there's been a lot in the news lately about El Nino developing, and it is stacking up to be a pretty significant event based on the rate of increase along the equator there. But that said, it's not impacting the returns that are going to come back this fall. So it's not part of the decision making for these bag limits. But it could have an impact later on this fall if it does alter the kind of precipitation patterns that we normally see in fall. So if we get lower flows than we normally get, there may be some low flow closures or restrictions. And then it almost certainly, if it develops the way it is, will impact future years' runs. So it could be a consideration down the line. And I think bigger picture, it's certainly true that El Nino and La Nina cycles have occurred throughout history, and we typically get salmon steelhead doing well during La Ninas and doing more poorly during the El Ninos, which is when we have these hotter, drier conditions. But things are changing, and it's in a couple of areas. So there's the underlying conditions that these large-scale climate patterns are also exacerbating. So, for example, we've been in 3 years of La Nina, which is pretty rare, of 3 in a row. But even during that time, we had several marine heat waves in the Northeast Pacific that were impacting runs. We had only 1 year of really good ocean entry conditions, which was in, I think it was 22. And then also, folks recall we've had drought, we've had fires on land during the summer. So even during the La Ninas, which are supposed to be the cool wet periods, we've had some pretty subpar conditions. And El Nino is really just going to exacerbate all of that, particularly in the ocean where there's just a lot of heat built up. So yeah, it has occurred over time, but things are trending worse, and El Nino just tends to exacerbate that. So hopefully that gets to the question, but there's a lot more around that subject.
Thanks, Sean. Got another one for you, Sean.
Is there anyone else?
There's a couple for other people coming on. Kirk says, it's great to hear a positive forecast for Chinook this coming fall season. With this being a more positive outlook for the populations and ODFW increasing potential harvest of wild populations, Kirk asked the question, is ODFW managing Chinook in the CMP and Rogue Fall Chinook plan for critical abundance or to achieve desired abundance identified in these plans?
Okay, cheers. Thanks, Kirk. Yeah, I just want to clarify up front, though, that department's proposed fisheries are not, we're not looking to increase harvest in this year in light of all the kind of circumstances we outlined. So there's actually reductions in harvest proposed here. But to your question about desired status, that's really a level that was set in the CMP and intended to be achieved by taking a variety of actions, including habitat protection and restoration, harvest regulation, and hatchery program management. But it's really the habitat actions that are going to provide the uplift that are going to result in increased returns down the line. And there's been a lot of work going on that front by the department and partners over the years, and more to come. There's a lot of investment now with the federal funds. So a lot of good things happening out on the landscape that hopefully will pay dividends down the line. Specifically to harvest, we're managing to avoid it becoming a limiting factor. We feel that managing under this kind of sliding scale regime, where we reduced harvest at lower run sizes and close fisheries when they're below critical abundance, is what's helping avoid that becoming a limiting factor. And then to your other point about spawning habitat, so spawning habitat isn't typically a limiting factor for fall Chinook. So you can have freshwater habitats not being fully seeded by spawners year after year without impacting the returns. It's the full seeding of rearing habitat that's a little more important for the Chinook. And that's difficult to determine, and it varies between years depending on the environmental conditions. So I'd say that, what I say? I guess Chinook have shown capacity to rebound rapidly in low return years. And even when spawner abundance falls below critical abundance conservation status, we can see them rebound from that. But we are trying to manage harvest to keep populations above that critical abundance and reduce the risk that that rearing habitat won't be fully occupied.
Good. Thanks, Sean. I'm going to give you a break and maybe get a cup of water there. But and Mike Gray from down south, the Coquille Coos, got a question for you, Mike.
Oh, good evening. Yeah, this is Mike Gray, district fish biologist out of the Charleston office for the Coos, Coquille, and 10 Mile Fish District.
Hey, Mike, we had a question from Timothy. He kind of wanted maybe a little update on the Coquille wild spawn counts. Maybe a reiteration of the lower of the Wild Cove fishery in the lower Coquille River, with mandatory release of all wild Chinook, based off wild counts in the last 2 years, and the 2023 projection of spawners.
Okay, yeah. So as was pointed out in the slide earlier, where Sean was showing an example of predation being a concern, we had the coquille spawning escapement in the for fall Chinook just drop off the table starting in 2018, and it was not forecast to do that. If we look at the 40 years leading up to that through 2017, we averaged about 9,000 spawners, and it was one of those graphs where the trend was on a slight increasing trend over that 40 years. No indication that anything critical was occurring. And then in 2018, that spawning escapement dropped off from that average of 9,000 fish to 500 fish. And it has persisted since 2018 through the 2022 return of being in the range of 500 to 1,000 fish. This last return in 2022 was about 900 fish. We do see a forecast this year of 1,200 fish, but that's still well below, less than half of the critical abundance or the conservation threshold of 2,800 fish. So that population is in severe decline and at a low level right now. You know, we think that we had the perfect storm or not so perfect that happened when the warm ocean conditions occurred starting in 2014 and then persisted into 2015 and 2016 with that blob out in the ocean in exactly the place where our Chinook go when they're maturing in the ocean. And we saw the other river basins along the coast take a hit from that warm ocean in that time period. But then the coquille has not rebounded from that. And one of the factors that we have is starting in around 2010, we were able to confirm what we believe was an illegal introduction of smallmouth bass into the coquille basin. And since 2010, those smallmouth have pretty much spread throughout the coquille basin and now inhabit the habitat that's suitable for that species. And it's exactly in a central area where the major tributaries that empty into the Coquille River, the major tributaries where the fall Chinook spawn, all empty into this main river area that's now inhabited by a very high concentration of smallmouth. So that's kind of the story on fall Chinook and the question about the wild spawning counts. Tim's question also was about the potential for a wild coho fishery in the coquille. We have foregone for the last couple of years any kind of salmon fishery in the coquille to protect those wild Chinook spawners. But we've crafted a season, or a proposal anyway, for a season for wild coho this year because, again, coho seem to be faring much better in their survival and returns. We've crafted a season that's about just short of a month long, September 15th to October 10th. Be very similar in time frame to what we're proposing for the coos. A 1 in 3 bag limit, which is the same bag limit that we're proposing for the coos, and a open fishery area from Highway 101 bridge up to the Sturdivant Park Bridge near Coquille. All of these, in crafting this season, the time frame, the bag limit, and the open area we've crafted in order to try to minimize impact to those wild fall Chinook that will be passing through the river at the same time. However, recognizing that, you know, there likely will be at least some impact to hooking mortality even with a catch and release fishery. Let's see the other part of the question. I think I hit all the points. Again, the 2023 projection for wild Chinook in the coquille is about 1,200 fish, so still well below the conservation threshold.
Great, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that. Yep. Next one is for Chris Kern, who is the West Region Manager. So Chris, we got a question from Scott that looks to be about the effects of closures in ocean fisheries. What effect would that have on our stocks if those being in Alaska's summer troll fishery is closed, and the effect of Chinook closures in the ocean fishery south of Cape Falcon?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think that's what the question was looking for. And so we can't, it's not something we can really measure very well, but for the Alaska question, certainly if they were to stay closed for the whole season, we should see an effect of an increased return coming south. Hard to say how much. It would alter a little bit, potentially some of the fisheries in between Alaska and Oregon a little bit, but should still be a net increase, all things considered. Relative to the fishing in the south of Falcon area, if that was indeed part of the question, the harvest rates in that area on North Oregon coast stocks in particular are not very high. Not to say it's zero, but it's pretty low. So wouldn't expect a lot out of that, but probably some small net gain from that, but might not be something we could detect just because of the low rate that typically occurs. So hopefully that covers it.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Sean, another question for you. So Ira asks, Sean, what good is the CMP process if you don't adhere to it?
I think I'd say that the CMP does allow the department to respond to changing conditions, and hopefully through the information we shared earlier in the presentation, it's pretty clear that conditions are changing and have changed since the plan was adopted in 2014. And so that we need to respond to make sure we don't negatively impact future opportunity. But again, we would like to hear your feedback on this through the survey. So please engage there.
Okay, thanks. Hold on 1 second. Let me look at this one real quick. Hold on. Okay. Sean, I guess this one's for you as well. Sean, this question is from Dana. And the question is, who has the ultimate authority in making decisions for our rivers here in Oregon?
Thanks, Dana. Yeah, so ultimately it's the commission, the ODFW commission, that has the authority. So it's the commission that adopted the Coastal Multi Species Plan and the Rogue Fall Chinook Plan into rule several years ago, and it's the commission that will approve ultimately the temporary rules that are adopted for this fall season. And then, Mike, I just want to take one. I've had some conversations with Scott Emmerman, and I see some questions coming in. Scott's been asking about whether we should adopt a slot limit to protect some of the older age fish. And I think that's something we could certainly consider. We didn't include it this year just because of the time needed to get an analysis done of what impact that would have. But I think that's something we could look at the CMP review to see whether that makes sense and take feedback on that.
Thanks, Sean. Another one just came in from Phil. And the question is, if a good return is predicted in future years, can we expect a return to 10 fish limits? And then the second part of that is, if mid-run this season predictions are wrong and larger run returns could be here by mid-season, would there be an update or increase in harvest?
Yeah. So yeah, Phil, if we do have a good return predicted in future years, it's certainly possible that we could expect a return to those limits. But again, we'd be looking at that year by year in terms of what the forecast is, what our confidence is in that forecast, what the environmental conditions are looking like, and kind of what the history of that particular basin is. So for example, in the Tillamook or Siaslo, for example, we'd want to see some sustained bounce back from the low returns we've seen recently before we want to go back there. Whereas in a basin like LC or potentially Nehalem, where we haven't seen as bad a recent history, there could be a potential there. But again, it's a case by case, and we'd look at it in the year. And then your question about mid-run, if it looks like the predictions are wrong, we don't have a really good way of assessing what the run strength is in season. We get input that potentially the fishery itself could be an indicator, but oftentimes, depending on the environmental conditions, it's really hard to tell whether the fishery is impacting fish that are kind of holding up and not moving, or whether the fish just aren't there. So yeah, we don't really have a good way of doing that in season, unfortunately, and that's something we'd like to work on.
Okay, great, Sean, thanks. That's actually all the questions that we received that weren't already kind of covered through the presentation. So I think we're getting close to 7 o'clock and can wrap it up, but I just will kind of go back to maybe this one slide again, just to kind of make sure folks, again, have this information about sort of the next way or how we can continue to engage in this process. So again, a lot more information will be on our website. This is the way to access that information. The survey should be online any minute now. So we'd like for folks to kind of jump over and take that survey and provide us some of that feedback. Please feel free to continue to submit questions if they come up as you think about this or watch the presentation again. And we're going to leave all that open until June 23rd to continue to accept questions. And of course, reach out to your local district biologist, like Sean offered himself as well. We want to make sure that folks have an opportunity to provide us as much feedback as you can. So thanks everybody for joining us this evening, and have a great night.